All right. On that note, my phone, it says 7:55, and that's the time I said. So we will call this work session to order on July 28th at 7:55. And I know when we had a work session with the Iowa Freedom Riders, a few weeks ago at this point, I made some notes, and I want to just kind of to reiterate them that, this is a work session. So board's not taking any action during this meeting, right? We want to just have some clarity on some of the suggestions that came, from the equity committee, and how how we're already working them into our plans, and how best we can work the rest of them into the plans, or any questions that we have of you guys, or any questions you have of us. We're also not going to be, speaking of, any specific employees or anything like that. So it's more just a chance for everyone here to just hear and listen and learn and provide some clarity there. So I'm not sure how best to turn this over. I think last time we did this, we kind of just worked through kind of one step at a time. I don't know if that's how we want to do it. I know, Matt, you can kind of make some suggestions how we move forward here, or we could turn it over to whoever wants to jump on. I'm breezy.
Sure, happy to do that, Sean, and definitely yield to Jane and what the equity committee wants to share with the board and the team tonight. But I think just to overview, like Sean said, there's a few documents on there that we tried to provide. One is the iteration of the action steps that the district has worked to refine kind of after each meeting or each listening opportunity. Jane, I did try to put on the document that the Iowa Freedom Riders had since updated, but it had kind of your suggested, or maybe some of the district's equity committee suggestions in there. And so that's not the IFR's most current document, but it's the one I think I had most recent information from the equity committee on. And then the IFR's document is on there too. And so I'm happy to, like I said, whatever way you guys want the conversation to go, but I think at least what would be useful for the administrative team too is based on some of those recommendations that we've put forward. And then as you guys have heard the conversation and heard the conversation with Iowa Freedom Riders and listening on that, what things are still missing, potentially from your perspective, or where would you, add on some pieces, or I guess ask us to look further at in that regard too. So I don't know. I think that's the big thing, right? I mean, I think the goal is, to continue to try to listen and then make sure that the action steps we commit to, we can get alignment where the district thinks it's appropriate. And then maybe the parts where we don't have alignment on some of those suggested demands or action steps from either group, we have a conversation around those and that component. So that would be, I guess, what I would say for an opening.
Okay. First, should we go around and introduce ourselves? Because we do have some new members, just so you know, everyone, and we're really excited to have 4 new students on our committee. So I don't know if the students want to start by introducing themselves, their year in school. Paris, perhaps?
Yeah, sure. My name is Paris. I'm going to be a senior at West High School. Yeah, I'm very excited to be on this committee.
And then we have, is Deja here?
Hi, I'm Deja. I'm going to be a senior as well at West High. I would also say, I don't think was Caroline added to the panelists? Because she said in the chat that she didn't have the option.
Yeah, I was just going to add Kim. It looks like very similar to when somebody raises hand, they're still in the attendees but can speak, but I don't think she's promoted to panelist.
Oh, okay.
She was on and then she left. And then now she's back on.
Oh,
There we go.
Is she there?
Okay. Just making sure
Perfect.
she's here. All right. Well, yeah, I'm Deja, going to be a senior at West. Glad to be here.
I'm Caroline. I'm going to be a junior at West.
Hi, I'm Aditi. I will be a senior at West also. Happy to be here.
I'm Rebecca Tilley, and I'm just a parent and concerned community member.
And I'm, again, Jane Finch. I'm the chair of the committee. Thank you for having us tonight. We really appreciate it. Well, first of all, just thank you for all the work that you're putting in for the Return to Learn plan. The amount of work is enormous. And we definitely aren't looking to add to your work or to add to the length of your meeting tonight, but we do want to, I think what we want is we want to be helpful and find out also from you. We want to know from you what would be helpful as you move forward with these challenging times, so that we can be more proactive and avoid further tipping points, such as what was discussed earlier tonight at Lucas. So I think that's what we are definitely looking from you, and how you can help us is to help us to know how to be more helpful to you. So I don't know if you want to go forward bit by bit, starting with the bullet points. And if you have particular questions about each of the recommendations that we made.
I think that's a good way to start as any, right? To get us moving into the conversation. Otherwise, we'll kind of be all over the place. So we might as well start there. And, you know, as different things pop up, we'll address those as they come.
Okay. Sounds good. So I know Rebecca was going to go over the first item, which is police presence.
So one of the, I guess I wanted to first say that I'm also a Lucas parent, and I've seen some of the devastation just that has been part of that trauma in our community. And I just wanted to say how much I appreciate the board taking that really seriously. And I do agree with you completely that, you know, it's not just a challenge at Lucas. It's just, in our situation, we came to a really strong tipping point. And so, and I feel like a lot of the work, many of the issues that were reflected in the Lucas report are also issues concerning this, things that the Equity Committee and the Iowa Freedom Riders have brought up as well. When it comes to policing, one of the recommendations of the committee was, you know, we know that the board has in the past made decisions to not put SROs into schools, and we think that was a good choice. We do think that there is an opportunity for the board, if you want to take it up, to do something more proactive and signal your, I guess, strong, or signal your recognition that having SROs in schools is not great for our Black and brown communities. And one of the ways that you could do that is by putting up sorry, what's the word I'm looking for? An administrative block to some degree, so that any future board, you know, should the makeup of the board change, they would have to go through an extra hoop in order to cause SROs to be placed into schools. We recognize in some respects it's just a signal, right? But then we do think it is an important signal to make. And so that was one of our first recommendations when it comes to police presence. Some of the other things related to police presence is that I know that the committee, have had a number of parents and come to us and describe situations where police and, you know, a variety of our municipalities have on the regular had folks just casually patrolling or school grounds. And I know that my family has observed this just when we've been, you know, for sporting events after school, just seeing police officers stationed by doors. We don't know for sure in that case if that was, maybe there was some particular reason why that was going on, but we know that some schools have had a much greater police presence than others. And we understand from listening to our community members that that can be, for certain members of our community, very, very traumatic and not something that makes the school environment feel welcome. And so one of the recommendations that the committee made was to see if we can work more closely with some of those police departments to make a regular, I guess, remove them from school grounds so that they're never regularly patrolling. We're not suggesting that police can never come to school grounds. Like, we recognize all the reasons why, you know, you might need to have police come onto school grounds, especially, you know, but we want that to be requested by a principal and not by, you know, in under certain conditions that are laid out, you know, carefully in a manual, following certain protocols rather than just sort of casually happening. Sorry, I'm working off memory right now because I didn't know I was going to be called on first. So, let's see. Not really come on school grounds. Yes, and then so having a more outlined protocol for when police are called. And then, you know, these things should apply during school hours, also during extracurriculars, including sporting events. And that, you know, we do need to, we need to have, I don't know, maybe we do need to have some kind of protocol for expectations when police are called onto campus for how those things are handled with equity and care. So whether that be, I think I saw a recommendation by somebody that, you know, maybe parents are called at the same time too, or, you know, some other situations like that. Do you all have any questions about that?
You're doing great.
Do the
I think the
students
basic thing I hear from you,
Okay.
Rebecca, is really the equity committee asking for some pretty clear parameters about, you know, police involvement, right? I think that's the consistent piece I hear from you about whether that's extracurriculars or on campus or patrols or whatever that might be, no matter the situation is, what are those specific parameters and guidelines surrounding that? That's kind of the ask from the equity committee in that regard. And then obviously where you started was the idea about kind of the extra layer step a future board would have to take to be able to, you know, even consider the idea of SROs or something like that. So I think I captured what you're thinking is there. It seems like you guys are maybe going to work off that first document in board docs, which is the action items, equity committee 621. Is that kind of, will that help us follow along just for people as we're going through that? Okay, great.
All right, Jane, I'm gonna kick it back to you. And you're on mute.
Sorry. Do the students have anything to add to that before we move on to the next one?
I would say a question that I have is looking at the administrative team action steps on that first document you just mentioned. How do these updates to the DEI translate into administrative action? I don't. I'm not exactly clear on that, but that, yeah.
So I think what you're asking there maybe is administrative team action steps. And so number 2 would, I think, kind of address what you guys were talking about, review current law enforcement involvement through the district. And so that would be to provide data around law enforcement tracking interaction with students on campus, provide more information and transparency around the care assessment team and process, were a couple things that we had identified on there. And then I think I was trying to look through the document here as we go along to see if there was another step where we'd also talked about law enforcement involvement. But as far as, I guess, how it relates to the DEI plan, when we look at those 2 goals there, what we really have is that goal 3 that I talked about with climate and culture, because obviously from even what you guys were saying in there, that that can hurt culture on some level as some of our stakeholders see the law enforcement's presence on campus. And then goal 2 specifically addresses disproportionality and discipline. And I think we've talked extensively in the district about, you know, the problematic, you know, increased contact with law enforcement and what that could do for some of our structurally disadvantaged populations if that happens early on. And so I think that's the 2 links to the piece there. I don't think we had a specific recommendation around changing that law enforcement practice right now. I think the initial recommendation from the team was trying to get maybe a lay of the land or a status update about what is currently going on Not that necessarily we're opposed to that conversation, but just as a starting point, and when we were doing some initial listening around that we felt that would be important, because I think Rebecca hit a couple of good questions there. You know, what are the legitimate reasons they might be currently being called? What are the ones that maybe where it's too often or too frequent and not necessary? So trying to get a better status update that, but Paras, I think that talks to those two goals. That's the link we tried to make in there.
And demand on the IFR on that document that I wanted to bring up was that police shouldn't be armed when they are called to school, and I thought that was a valid point. Maybe unless they've been called for because there's a weapon at school or there's a shooting or something. But other than that, I think it adds a layer of danger that's not really necessary usually for when students are called. And with how police brutality is outside of school, it's bad to bring that in with a gun. So.
So I have a question.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Daisha.
So does the ESC have data on how many times a police officer is called or like enters a school? Like, do we have that data?
Deja, I'm not sure we would have that. I think that's part of what that effort would be, to try to better capture that, right? Because we would have it if it lived in a student's discipline referral, that there was some kind of a police involvement or potentially that police were called in that instance. But to be honest, I don't think we would track that every time we'd have police on campus. You know, I think some of that data collection would involve even an example you guys provided there about, you know, if you go to the football game on Friday night, or you see some of our basketball events, or just different large crowds, those opportunities we're gonna, you would see law enforcement at those events. And so I think those would all be data markers too for us, right? About when, I mean, I think that's what the question is when are they on our campus and what does that look like? And so that we would not be tracking. I mean, we could ballpark it, we could give it a guesstimate, but I think some of the other instances you guys have brought up about when are they called, you know, maybe out of somebody's discretion in that regard. And if it doesn't result in a discipline referral or some type of a scheduled event where we have them, therefore we wouldn't have real firm data on those events.
So Matt, I'm wondering if we could, if it would be possible just to make a survey, take a survey of all the principals and ask them how many times they estimated a police officer was asked to come on to their into their building or on the site, or how many times officers came without a request by the building administration. To me, that's data that can be gathered in a couple 3 days probably, and it's won't be terribly accurate, but it'll be fairly accurate in a way to get started and looking at what the prevalence is for officer presence on campus.
Yeah, I think there's a way we could go about that, Charlie. I think just one thing for the board to consider tonight as we work through some of these pieces with the equity committee is going to be how much conversation you want to get into around potential solutions or suggested actions you guys are wanting us to take, and how much you're wanting to take in their feedback and then come back to another conversation around that. Because I do think there's multiple things and probably multiple action steps around each of these issues, just like the conversation around if the board does want to put some policy in place around, future SRO consideration. And so that's the only thing I'd say. I'm happy to do any of those things. Obviously, you direct our team to do, and I think there's a lot of valuable work that has to get started in that regard. But I think we just need to balance that through the conversation about how are we going to follow up on all these pieces then, right? Because I think we're also going to have to prioritize some of the work to know what's the most important piece to start with and where do you want us to go. So just kind of put that out there as a catch-all too as we start down some of these conversations. But you're right.
I agree with you.
Data around that. Yep.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to circle back to Caroline. I think you asked the question about officers being armed. And if I recall correctly from when Chief Matherly was the police chief, he told us that anytime a police officer is on the clock, they have to be armed. That's his rule, or the police rule. So that's something that may have to go to the city council side of things because we really can't dictate that part of it, I don't believe. Also, if I'm not mistaken, and maybe Matt or Chase might know this better, but if I recall correctly, also the legislature last year or this past session also passed some sort of laws about the who can carry guns on campus. That was a big talk. I remember during our board, or not necessarily on campus, but when they're dropping kids off for school, or if they're at a sporting event, if they're a concealed carry or they're licensed to carry, who can carry on campus. And so that's another thing that that happened at the state level. So just like things like that take place, just that's something that's going to have to take, you'll have to take up at a higher level than what we can dictate, because that's what the state law now says.
Yeah, I think what we would be able to say is, you know, if you didn't want armed officers on campus, then it's just going to be, do you get officers on campus at all? Right? I mean, I think that's, you know, the link you're making there, Paul. Then they, you know, those different institutions, we work with 5 different municipalities. And so then the sheriff's office or the city police departments would potentially respond to that differently, or we could probably anticipate what the response might be just based on what you shared there from Chief Matherly at the time, right? That, well, then they may not come. And so again, not stating a preference or an opinion on that, just I think that's the dot you're connecting on that level. And then as far as the concealed carry, yeah, there's specific laws around what that can, what that looks like, and who can do that and when.
That's
Yeah, I guess-
that's understanding too, is that the gun is part of the uniform and it's an all or nothing type of thing.
Yeah, I guess I'm interested, frankly, right now, as having the staff propose some not too complicated policy changes so that we can decrease the number of times local police are invited to come to a building or on site, and have some parameters around what the principal needs to establish before that happens.
Okay, are we ready to move on to discipline? Okay, sounds like it. So, you know, in terms of our recommendations surrounding discipline under the DEI Action Plan 2A, these aren't new. I think we talked about these recommendations a couple of years ago when we presented to the board. I believe it was May 2018. So we really recommend that the DPP be evaluated by a team of diverse stakeholders and revised to make it more culturally competent and to include restorative practices. We would also like the DPP to be made public, such as on a website, so that it's more transparent. That's actually about all I have to say about that. Do the students especially have anything to say about the discipline piece?
I was just looking through the equity committee proposed action items that we proposed and the Our Freedom Riders proposals, and I think that one ties in maybe with their suggestion of involving more social workers in this sort of discipline. I don't know exactly what that looks like in terms of implementation, but as a student, I don't exactly know what standard disciplinary procedures look like. So I think clarifying, like you said, clarifying that to students and to families would be important.
So for me, like, I have an idea of, like, I know what restorative practices are, and I've practiced them myself. I've had some teachers who are qualified in like facilitating circles and things of that nature. But as far as like the rate of discipline, like the disciplinary rate, I know that Black and brown students are disciplined at a far higher rate than the white students in our district. but I don't know the specifics, nor do I know where our problems lie necessarily. So I would like to see data on that. Like, I don't know if it's like fights or, you know, like getting the police called on them and things like that. Like, I don't know the specifics of what that discipline came from, you know? So I would like to see data on that as well.
And Matt, that's something that you guys present us in the climate study, isn't it? I mean, I know we've seen that data before where it breaks it down onto race and when they're called and for what.
Yeah, that's in the annual progress report that we typically present every fall around like what Deja's talking about there, around some of the where is the discipline coming from, right? Where are the suspensions coming from? Where are the referrals coming from? And she's right, you know, about the rate of discipline for our Black and brown students. But we can break, you know, we kind of break it down by categories in there. And then the work from the district over the last few years has involved areas we've identified to stop doing suspensions around and tried to decrease those suspensions in those areas. But, you know, obviously those rates in other areas still continue. And so that's been a part of our work as we've looked at those discipline protocols and procedures. I do think they bring up a really relevant point there too around, I think in our recommendation, we put it around restorative practices like Deja mentioned, but I think as Jane read that piece, you know, it's that cultural competent or proficient practice incorporated too with our staff in that regard. And so it's probably twofold, right? It's also on the training of doing that, and then how we restore or repair a situation when it's happened as well.
Also, is there a clear cut way to like discipline each student? Like, I know that there's a white binder that entails all of the disciplinary protocols, but how accepted is that over the entire district? Or do administrators and teachers just kind of like go with the flow with each incident?
Our expectation is that they follow that. I mean, that's our district protocol and procedure. And so that is supposed to be followed. You know, at one of these meetings, I talked about the group that had created that. I think that part of what we've heard in conversation is then how has that been reviewed, you know, over the course of time, and who else potentially would need some eyes on that to know if it's sufficient for what our current practices are now. But, you know, I'm not going to say we have perfect 100% compliance to it, Deja, but I would say that, you know, the expectation is that that's what drives those disciplinary conversations, and that's what we should be following. But like I said, I mean, I'm sure there's work to do in that to make sure we're consistently adhering to that thing, because that was part of those conversations as it was initially developed. You're right, is that there was no guidance. There was kind of some pretty open-ended consequences that would happen to students. And so part of that was trying to make sure that there was a consistency and handled to it, but that hasn't necessarily, I would say it's dropped our overall rates of referrals and suspensions to have that consistency, but we still have the problem of the disproportionate referrals and suspensions. That hasn't went away because of it, but from overall rates of consequences to students, you know, we've seen a decrease in those, we've seen a decrease in suspensions, but the rate is still problematic, obviously.
Yeah, Matt, you're exactly right. The disproportionality is just horrendous, especially for Black students, particularly. And whatever practice is being applied in classrooms right now, it's not working at all for Black students. So one thing we could do, our one approach is to follow the equity committee and the staff's recommendation, which is to look at whether or not the formal disciplinary rules and guidelines have biases written within them. Another approach, which actually is what I favor, is for the board simply to tell the administration, we cannot have a disproportionality in office referrals that's greater than 1.0, and let the superintendent and staff figure out how to do that.
And oh, go ahead.
No, fine.
If I'm correct, the DPP is like it's not public and open to the public, and I think that doesn't make any sense. And I think it's also when they made it, it was based on the previous year's office referrals, which means that it's based in racism and bias in those referrals. And I could be speculating about the DPP, but I think there's some racism in it. And if it was public, we could fix those practices.
Well, Carolyn, I would say obviously it's racist because look at the result. Okay. And if there's a policy now for not making the DPP a public document, the board can change that.
I don't think we have any issue with,
Easily.
if there's any, I don't know, maybe I'd ask one of my other team members in there. So I'm not saying something I don't know about, but I don't see why, those protocols and procedures wouldn't be, or that we couldn't obviously work to do that. One thing, I know that we have some, Amy, were you going to jump in with something there before I go on to my next point? No, you popped up on my screen. So I didn't know
it could be made public.
Talk or not, but I think it can be. And so the other thing I think just that we have to remember is obviously the results are not okay. They're, like Charlie said, I mean, those are highly problematic results for us of what's going on. I do think, and I know that people have disagreed with me, community commenters, even on how I talked about this, but it wasn't like the district went alone to create those. Juvenile court was involved in that conversation. There were stakeholders in the community that were involved in that conversation. There was a large grant. I believe the district was awarded, and there was training provided at Georgetown to try to make a discipline protocol binder that was equitable, that did try to achieve some balance between, so we didn't have different administrators giving different consequences. And so there was a heavy amount of work and background that went into the development of that. But again, obviously it needs to be refined. It needs to be reflected of our current lay of the land, and that work, I think that work was coming to completion when I arrived in the district. I remember sitting in those conversations as it was being completed. And I think what I had heard from some community members the last time we talked about that is that maybe that wasn't buttoned up the way it should have been, or wasn't vetted through some final community groups before implementation. But I know you had social service agencies in town as part of that group too. And so there was a multi-stakeholder effort to bring that forward. That wasn't something the district just authored on its own and put forward. I do believe there was a lot of eyes on it. Now, did everybody come to the same agreement that it was sufficient or great at the time? I don't have the history on that. But I think obviously the need is evidenced here that we have to do a review of it, right? And that we have to try to involve a diverse set of eyes into that and refine it further. But I just don't want us to lose that context, because I do think there's probably community partners in town that would be somewhat offended if we just wrote that off to that work wasn't well-intentioned. But we know good intentions don't always do the cause either. And so just one thing out there probably for some understanding about where that came from.
Yeah, and one way to address a slightly different way to address disproportionality is to take a decision point approach, just like it's done in law enforcement. And you look at the disproportionality that occurs in every decision that's made to take a child out of a classroom or send them to the office. And you look for the disproportionality at each decision point, and you figure out ways to remove the disproportionality. So that's a way of keeping the DPP as it is, if that's necessary, but to changing the way it's implemented so that it does not result in the disproportionality that's now occurring.
And I think that's where we've worked on the fringes, Charlie, to that point. And I'm not necessarily saying we need to keep it the same. I think there's work we have to do on it. I think that's important. We've talked about for too long now about making sure restorative practices are put into the protocols. I mean, that needs to happen, right? That needs to be a piece of it. And so I think there's work that needs to be done on that. But I think your decision point conversation there is a wise one from the standpoint that when we've looked at areas where we're going to stop suspending kids, I think I can remember a time here in the district where we were suspending kids because of poor attendance. Well, that's probably the worst thing you could do for a kid that's not attending school, right? And so, I mean, we've come from places like that to then looking at what are some of those other soft areas, verbal aggression or something like that, where then now, well, we need to stop suspending for actions like that, because we know that's a a disproportionate point, as you were making the example of there. So I know the other group I was struggling to come up with would have been the Disproportionate Minority Commission that I know has had significant turnover here in the last couple of years, but that would have been another community group that would have been involved in that work. So I think what we know some general direction there that we already have identified internally we need to do around those protocols and procedures. But I also hear that point that I heard a couple of the students make too about the transparency nature of that, right? That if that's where we're going by, then we should be sharing that out.
I just want to, sorry, JP. I'm just going to jump in and say, you know, I totally I agree with a lot of the points that Carolyn and Deja has raised, that I do think that it has to be transparent. Because even as a parent, I mean, I had a child that went from K through 12. I have no clue when the DPP was implemented, but I didn't even know it existed until I was a board member and had the opportunity to see it. So I think if we have rules in the game that people should follow, it's fair that everybody knows what those rules are, because then you're setting up an unbalanced game. So there will only be certain winners if not everybody know the rules to the game. The other piece, I think that updating the DPP that does include restorative practices district-wide will be key, because there's different ways for us to handle issues and discipline. And I know, Matt, that's something that you've talked about, at least I know with me. I think you've said it publicly too, but that's something that we would like for our district to start moving towards district-wide, because I know we have several teachers who are trained in restorative practices, but I really would like to see that like on a wider view, just as an individual board member.
Yeah, I really agree absolutely with that point. You know, the other advantage to making it public is some of the problematic stuff in there really has to do with the language that's used. It's just racist language and not very culturally competent. And if we could just get something public, I think, you know, that would then people would notice those things and be able to point out, hey, you know, this reference, just the more eyes that are on it, so we can kind of clean it up and then do the fundamental work, I think, to change the practices towards a restorative model.
And Matt, I just wanted to chime in. I think if I recall correctly, I was sitting on the other side of the table in the community seats when this whole thing came out. But you're totally right. I don't think there's any reason that this one can't be shared. I think the only one that we can't share out is like that's the specific safety one with.
Yeah, I know that one we don't want to, but yeah, the discipline protocols and procedures. Yeah, we can. Obviously, it's a need. Obviously, it's a step we need to take. And then obviously the updating of it too is critical for us. So.
I think Rebecca was going to take curriculum.
I didn't remember that, but that's fine. So I know there's been a number of stakeholders that have brought to the attention of various boards, principals, some problematic instructional materials. And I feel like, you know, in the immediate action item, one of the things that we were absolutely 100% certain about was that the 5th grade social studies textbook has some really problematic content in it that has been addressed by internally by the district, but you know, those books still live within the school, and we recognize why it's a challenge to pull books out of a classroom quickly, but we do feel like that's something that needs attention, frankly. The other thing that we were very interested in having added to the DEI plan was some kind of statement about adding proactive anti-racist curriculum at all grade levels. This is something, I think one of the lessons that we can learn from this time is that racism is something that we can't defeat in passivity. It's something that we have to challenge in ourselves all the time, right? And so I think if we're going to be a strong kind of parent-teacher community, one of the ways that we do that is, you know, we ask parents to do certain work with our children and how we teach them and talk to them, but we would also like that reflected, you know, in our schools as well. And what avenue that takes, whether that's through guidance curriculum or more, you know, throughout the curriculum, we think that's important to have. And as well as there definitely needs to be, you know, during curriculum review processes, whether that be art, history, math, all the things, we need to have a very robust equity review process when it comes to picking curriculum. So we don't have issues like with that 5th grade social studies textbook. I mean, somebody should have caught that back when that material was implemented. And I know that, for example, I think is it ACT, don't they, you know, when they're developing test questions, they have outside reviewers that look for things like, you know, how would this impact somebody who is Native American? How would this impact someone who has a disability? A similar approach to be taken with our curriculum to make sure that we're thinking about it from every lens, from every viewpoint, and making sure that every student in the district has as equitable and robust education as possible.
I think in that document we talked about the American Studies curriculum for 9th grade. And I took that freshman year, and there's a lot of room for anti-racist teaching. And I know that it's hard. I don't know really how we would do this, but a lot of people are able to skip that class by taking APUSH or AP US History and AP Human Geography. And I'm not sure about AP US History because they didn't finish the year this year, but I don't know if there's a way we could somehow implement some anti-racist stuff in that, although it's AP, so I know it's restricted a little bit.
I had a question sort of like regarding what's like the procedure to change like school district curriculum or specific materials? What does that look like usually?
Amy, do you mind taking that one about if they wanted to challenge a resource? Or I don't think Laura's still on here.
So I'm not sure if you're asking about challenging the resource or just thinking about our overall curriculum adoption process. So I'll start maybe sharing the latter, which I talked about a little bit last time with Iowa Freedom Writers. Our curriculum adoption cycle is anywhere from a 7, 8, 9-year cycle, and we you know, target certain curriculum over that period of time. Unfortunately, I would say in the last 5 years that I've been here, we've had to delay that cycle a couple of times because of budgetary constraints. When I was sharing that information last time, I think, you know, a big piece that, you know, we are thinking about, of course, in this conversation is just our social studies texts and classes in general. And social studies is set to be reviewed, I think, in 2 years out. And so we've gone about the work just behind the scenes to see what kind of financial impact also it would have to switch around what we had on target for next year. To Matt's other point, he was talking about reconsideration. And so when that was the 5th grade text, that chapter in the text that I think Rebecca was talking about, that was brought to our attention. And as outlined in board policy, there's a process that we undertake to review that. There's committee members that are drawn into the conversation. And so with that chapter, then we work to take it out of the curriculum and offered a training through Teaching Tolerance in March to our teachers with content that would replace that. So there's another avenue for that piece. Let's see. Rebecca talked about adding the anti-racist curriculum. That would be, of course, something if we were thinking about doing that explicitly. Does that reside or does that sit with a course that's already offered? So as we look across the K-12 spectrum, is that something you would do in a social studies adoption year? Or do we see that as something standalone? And then where are those opportunities for that to be addressed? So for example, at the elementary level, we are bringing in officially and formally morning meetings as an expectation. Some buildings have been doing it informally. At your junior high and your high school buildings, you have opportunities possibly during intervention block. So those are the kind of avenues or the places that we would think about doing some of that. But there's a whole, bunch of topics taken there all at the same time. And again, it's just figuring out where the priorities lie and what we're going to bite off first or second or all together at the same time.
So is it an expectation for schools to have some sort of like anti-racist module in any course, or is it just like a suggestion?
So maybe I can speak to that a little bit, Deja. One, anti-racism specifically isn't required, but what is required is some sort of multicultural, gender fair curriculum. But the way that often works, it's like you have an international night, one night a year, and you invite families, and that's it. And then you check the box. So it's very compliance based. So really it would be up to a teacher how much they would integrate that into their overall curriculum. And that's, I guess on this question, what I don't want to do is say, well, we have to wait for curriculum adoption, because I think there are two problems with that. One, that's a budgetary thing that we're not going to be able to afford all new curriculum, right? If we find out that, that's just a budgetary reality where it really comes down to, you either choose in some years to keep teachers or to buy new books, right? And so it's easy to delay that. The other problem I think with that is it compartmentalizes anti-racism and says, well, that's a social study issue, when really it's a culture issue, and it should be diffused throughout. And that's why I think Amy's suggestion that ways we can start to really tackle this, right away, and ways we are doing it is through things like morning meetings. And then at the secondary level, when I was teaching at West, when we had advisory period, that was often very much a throwaway 20 minutes, and there wasn't curriculum around it, and there wasn't really any directed activity. But I think there are ways we can start to infuse this in our current structures, as well as, the second point, we really have to put equity at the front of our lens when we're reviewing all of our curriculum, including math, including science. All of it really, because, the folks who published the book in 5th grade, whereas we were made aware of sort of the most egregious thing, my guess is that attitude runs through the whole entire curriculum, right? And so I think we really immediately, with all the curriculum we review, we have to add that robust equity process. And then I think the proactive anti-racist curriculum, the way we're going to get that at all grade levels is through these activities that are happening in the classroom, which frankly also is going to require a lot of training of a lot of our teachers to be able to handle that in a culturally proficient way, in my opinion.
So is the question, how do we get teacher buy-in to a point where they don't want to just make it a one-day activity and check off a box? Is that the goal?
I think that's a really important piece. If we're going to make anything work, we're going to have teacher buy-in. And so that's really to the larger point of culture and climate, I think is one, it's something we can start doing right away. And two, it's, there's some budgetary implications for training, but we also already offer training, and we have, room to pick what kind of training we offer to some degree.
Got it.
Yeah, and Deja, I don't know if it's always, necessarily waiting for that buy-in either. I think, as JP and Amy talked there, part of it's looking for the opportunities about where we can start right now and where are those pieces we can put in, that anti-racist teaching comes in, and what are the vehicles to move that forward currently, and then what are some other long-term approaches to that. But I think the urgency around it has to be how we approach our daily teaching right now. And just because we have an adopted resource doesn't mean that's the only resource we can do to have that. That doesn't mean that we have to wait to improve until we do a new curriculum cycle. I think, the front end lens about when we do approve and adopt new curriculum is obviously critically important. I feel like as a district, we've made some steps in that and tried to include some additional representatives into that, but we have a long ways to go in really being able to vet that sufficiently. And so I think we're looking for all those opportunities to do that. And as we take on new processes, even around return to learn, as we approach those things and how we put equity lens on all of those things, when we talk about universal design for equity, I think there are many important parts we put in there, but that anti-racist teaching portion, we have to look for opportunities where we can start that now and take some urgency there. And it's not just social studies. I think that was the other part that JP said that I think is important too, because a lot of times it goes right to social studies, but we teach a lot of literature in our language arts classes. You know, the way we approach conversations in math and science are especially relevant too, and in our electives. And so we have a lot of work to do in those areas, but I think you guys hit some, you know, very high level relevant points for us.
I have a question. Is right now, has that been communicated to teachers as an opportunity to start involving anti-racist curriculum into their classes as they are adopting their classes to potentially be online, or considering the Edgenuity classes that you mentioned earlier in the meeting? How, because this is kind of a open-ended transition period for curriculum. How has that been included in this discussion?
Yeah, that's perfect. That's exactly where I was going with some of the return to learn stuff. So as we've done those course development processes, yes, we've had a front end on the application to talk about culturally responsive teaching. And then we also have a group that will be working to meet with those teachers that are developing those courses, provide training, and then trying to do, I don't think we have it all the way fleshed out yet because we're not towards the completion of the creation of those courses, but some look at trying to vet those or look at the finished product of those. And so that's where I'm saying, as we approach new activities, it's especially important that we put those things in on that end too, right? That we're not trying to then go back and retrofit something there. It should have that in mind as we create those. And so great question on that, because that was where I was talking about with that universal design for equity and the return to learn progress.
I'd like just to expand off of that and share how intentional that we've been. So as we've asked teachers to create our courses for online content, part of that little survey that we put out that asks if they're interested, just ask them several questions. And there's a question around cultural competency that's embedded in there. And then as they're working to construct the course, and they utilize something called a field guide for that, one of the components in the field guide is a rubric essentially that we've had vetted by some people within the district, and Laura Gray is one of them, that is asking the developers to consider culturally responsive teaching. And even just this week, Laura and Brady hosted a workshop for those course people involved in the current course construction, specifically around that topic. And then, like Matt said, there's other opportunities on the back end, but we're being very intentional right now about this as we're developing these online courses.
Anybody else have anything to add before we move on to social and emotional learning? So I feel like this is something that's brought up and up and up again. And then of course we never have the funding for it, but echoing what Ruthina noted earlier in the board meeting, now is especially important time for this, and that is to increase our school counselors and social workers. And just building on what Amy mentioned earlier in the morning meetings, I think that's part of that. When we talk about the restorative pyramid, a lot of what people think about when we talk about restorative practices is that very top piece of the pyramid, which is the conflict resolution and the repairing harm. But that's really only a small part of restorative practices. The base is woven into school life, the everyday circles that you have, such as in morning meetings, or maybe you incorporate circles into your teaching, and so that the students learn how to interact in that way. And then they know when it comes to time to have a problem solving circle or a conflict resolution circle, they're used to it, and they've built those relationships. Those relationships are there. And so, restorative practices comes up again with the emotional and mental health, as it does in the discipline, because it's not just for discipline. And then of course the social emotional learning strategies that in addition to restorative practices are important as well. And I'm wondering if the students have anything to add to that. I know that we have some students here who have done circles. They may have been trained in circles as well. So I'm really interested to hear what the students have to say.
I was trained in restorative justice in junior high by one of my teachers who had been practicing restorative justice for a really long time. So I've had the opportunity to kind of see it in action as you guys have put these policies in place and encourage teachers to adopt those policies. So, I mean, I guess I would kind of have an interesting perspective on it. I would encourage all teachers to practice restorative justice and participate in circles with their students, because I do believe that it brings students closer together, and it has a certain impact with nonviolent communication and conflict resolution, as you were saying, Jane. So I would be very interested in seeing how we continue that throughout like all grade levels. I've seen a few circles and participated in a few circles at the high school level, but definitely more that the circles increase as you go down, actually, not as you go up. And I would like to implement, I would like to see that implemented throughout the secondary schools.
To add to what Deja said, I've observed that there's sort of a misconception around restorative practices that, oh, that's not for advanced or AP classes, or, oh, there's only time for that in a language arts class. So I think adopting that in an administrative way could be, like, you know, JP has mentioned, changing the culture around this sort of thing as being something that can make a lot of change. So like imbuing policy with something that recognizing that these practices are useful across the board could be a good start.
Yeah, that, you know, frankly, I think both of these go together, the social and emotional learning, which again is required by Iowa law recently. But to me, circles, homeroom, advisory, morning meetings are all ways that we already have here that we can just get our staff trained in those things. And I'm hopeful that, you know, we can, with the push from above, that we can really make some progress and get, because you know, you do have to buy in, right? Circles. And I think to buy in, people just have to see them work and understand that they can be very effective for community building and all, you know, on up to conflict resolution. So this is one, frankly, where I'm a little more hopeful that, you know, hiring more counselors and social workers is, you know, it's always a budget question and we only have so much, but these are things that feel more workable to me.
I was
Add
also,
that I think we're,
oh,
sorry, Carolyn.
go ahead. Okay. I was also trained in junior high with Miss Austin and Laura Gray. And I this year, one of the counselors did some circles with some seniors in ELP. And I think it was really good for them all. And they, I think it was community, but I don't like that it was only on ELP kids, because that's a very selective group that I don't even agree with how they select ELP kids to begin with, but that could be helpful for everyone. And that's a place to start, but I think it would be really helpful for everyone, not just ELP.
I think the one thing I want to add about the restorative practices is that there really is a grassroots movement here in the community, and there are pockets, there are certain schools, there are teachers, they're doing it. But what we really need is it to come from the top now. They really need that push for it to be district-wide. that's the one other thing I wanted to add. I don't know if you want to move on to personnel now, or if you had anything else to say about mental and emotional health.
I think I would just add that we are going to be bringing some social emotional learning curriculum to our classroom teachers as well as our junior high teachers. And I'm going to need to have Matt weigh in a little bit as I'm trying to catch up to speed on some of the secondary stuff. But Laura Daly and team are working on that. So JP was right. In the springtime, the Department of Ed released, and it even may have been last fall, their first draft of SEL competencies by grade level bands. So those were vetted for a while. And so as we're working to formally put the morning meetings in the elementary schedule, there's a list of resources that is being developed. Laura Gray's had her hands in that. Laura Daly and her team have had their hands in it as well. So that is something that we're working to put in our PD schedule to get in the hands of our teachers. You know, in the springtime when we went into school closure, we did have morning meetings or asked that our teachers reach out a couple of times to our students. But some of them were proficient in holding morning meetings because their buildings had been invested in doing that, and others, you know, are doing it for the first time. So we're trying to bring some more formalization to that. I do think that we'll be seeing, and Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, the new SEL curriculum come through during intervention block time at the junior highs. And then the high school, I think they're weaving together a series of resources as well. So Matt, do you want to speak to the secondary piece?
Yeah, I think you hit it there, Amy. I mean, I was going to jump in with that too, with the SEL curricula. That's its plan for us. And so that one's an easy one for us to say, yes, we'll move on. I think we already have that in motion at all levels to implement that social emotional learning curriculum. It's been a big topic of our return to learn plan too, as we just, again, have focused on, you know, kind of the trauma nature of what everybody's experienced, you know, in the kind of two pandemic lenses. We look at that with the global pandemic and then the pandemic of racism, and trying to know that we're going to intentionally need to deal with the social, emotional, mental health, you know, of our students and of our staff coming back to our environment. So a big one for us, and one we definitely have plans that we've solidified to move forward on.
I'll take personnel. I'm not going to highlight everything that we wrote here, just a couple of things. One is I was pretty surprised when I discovered that we're not tracking retention rates of our teachers and administrators of color. Like by year to year, we know what percentage we have in the district, but to the best of my knowledge, we're not tracking our retention rates, how well we're retaining those teachers. And so I appreciate the goal to hire and grow our own and things like that. But then if we're losing those teachers, then, you know, that's a problem. We could be replacing them, but then if we don't know why certain ones are leaving, that's a problem. The other thing is that I think it'd be really instructive to have a more formalized process for conducting exit interviews with teachers and administrators of color who leave the district, so we can try to hone in on even more carefully what are some of those cultural climate issues that are challenging. And then kind of to go off the conversation we were just having with socio-emotional stuff with our students, I feel like a lot of the benefits of circles could definitely be applied to our faculty and staff and administrators, and even parents on certain occasions where there's conflict, whether that be, you know, conflict between teachers, you know, principals and teachers and parents. And I think what an incredible way for them to, you know, maybe not model in front of other students, but then to experience themselves, and how helpful that can be to, you know, create an environment that is conducive to understanding and learning, and then to be able to hopefully go out and model that, you know, in their own classrooms. And I think that's something where I cannot remember who said this, if it was Jane or one of the students, but, you know, this whole notion of having that be more of a top-down piece as well. And I guess the other thing I wanted to highlight as well was that it'd be great if, you know, in whatever annual evaluation systems that teachers have, that those efforts are recognized, like that they're measured, that they are referenced, that they're, you know, recognized in some way. So like, I work at the university, having some kind of DEI competency every year is something I report on myself, right? And so it would be great if that was built into teacher evaluations as well.
Yeah, I think the last part there that I caught from you, Rebecca, was that competency piece. And that was a part of our recommendations, right? About trying to come forward with an additional standard that we'd work with the association to put into the staff evaluations. I mean, there's a piece of it in the current 8 standards and 42 criteria for our teachers and the 6 leadership standards, but we thought almost something more intentional in that regard from a, obviously a support and accountability mechanism, right? I mean, first we want to support people and give them the training, but then we also need to have accountability too, that these are our expectations and we'd expect you to, be at this level to be a proficient employee here. So I think that's a good one.
So Matt, to move those standards into the formal evaluation process, will that require us waiting until the next contract negotiation, or can we do it with the EA outside of the contract negotiations, or in between the annual negotiation?
Matt, do you mind?
No, I was going to say, do you want to?
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry,
No,
Chase. I'm sorry.
That's all right. It's all right. So when the legislature changed Chapter 20 a couple of years ago, Charlie, evaluation became one of the topics that was taken out of the negotiated agreement, and actually it's on the prohibited list. So we can't bargain evaluation. That doesn't mean that we wouldn't want to involve the association if we made any changes to the evaluation tool. But the good news is we're more nimble, and so we could make those changes, I think, as you might be suggesting, more quickly than waiting for the negotiation process to start up next year. If we wanted to move on that this year, really our only self-imposed deadline is September 30th. JP will remember that. We haven't changed that one, that we notify all of our teachers of what the evaluation framework will be and who is on evaluation by that date. So we do have some space still, even this summer and this fall, to make those changes to the evaluation tools.
Okay, great, thanks.
Matt, the other thing I'd just add, and I appreciate Rebecca's comment, and I do agree that we need to track some of those pieces a little bit more closely and look at adding the exit interview to what we do. But we must just need to really probably publicize a little more. We do track retention data. It's actually something we shared with the board 2 years ago. It didn't come out in the annual report this year. I don't think, Jeremy, we'll check with Nick. He's not in here. But we published those statistics based on our teachers of color and admin of color in the HR report that we gave to the board back in March 2019. So point well taken on that. We probably need to make that more visible, but that is something that that we've tracked for several years and actually can show the trend lines on where that is in terms of our staff of color.
And maybe just to go back to Charlie's question that Chase took there first, that we should just mention too, I do think we have ability to do that in good movement. The association, brought us that idea. And so I don't think that's going to be a problem for us. And I don't think I'm speaking out of turn to say that. And so I think they're obviously willing and committed and brought forward that idea to do something similar. We do think it's important for administrators to also have that, as portion of their evaluation too. And so we'd look at that component there. So just wanted to give our teachers a little bit of a shout out too, that they know that, and that's something they're asking for too, and trying to hold themselves to high expectations.
I would even like to add that teachers of color and admin of color need more support. And that comes from every angle. And I would even believe that like the same issues that we're going through with the lack of supports for students of color and all the lacks that this district falls short for students of color is the same thing that teachers of color are going through, just on a different scale. And if we fix that, I think our retention rate might go up. And I would agree with Rebecca that like we and Chase that our retention rate is low for teachers and admin of color. and that like if we track down some of those issues of why they left or anything like that, then we could actually come to some consensus of what this problem is, and we could have more representation across the board.
Deja, I want to step in there just real quick. I 100% agree about providing support and being more accessible and championing our teachers and our administrators of color. But our retention rate is not low. It's over 90% for our teachers of color. And we need to probably, again, look at this last year. But that's not to say that we can't do better and we can't provide more robust supports for our teachers of color. But I don't want people to walk away from the conversation with this idea that we have a low retention rate for our teachers of color, because that's just not what our data has shown. That doesn't undercut our need to, again, provide better support networks, because I hear that and I believe in that, but I want to balance that against what our data has shown about really what those retention rates are.
My apologies.
No need. I think that's good. That's why we have these conversations, right? I think it's important for us to really have that clarity and that transparency.
Do we compare those retention rates with any particular benchmarks?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like our overall retention rates and our other.
Do we compare with Waterloo School District or with Des Moines School District or their retention rates?
We'll have to look at the retention rates. That data is a little bit harder to come by, but as we look at our hiring percentages, we outpace the vast majority of school districts in the state. We're way above the state average when it comes to hiring. And I know that's the other end of the equation, right? When you look at the cycle of employment, hiring is only one piece. It's really how do you retain and grow your staff. Those data points are a little more difficult to come by, but it's something that we can continue to explore and make part of our data set if we can get that.
Do we compare retention rates with faculty of color or faculty or like white faculty? Is that, I guess I'm trying to figure out why you say it's high.
Well, because it's about 95%. And when the national average for teacher retention is 85%, and our retention rate for teachers is 5 to 10 points above that, we would consider that good. And when we talked earlier in the board meeting about the staffing crisis that's hitting the country, to have retention rates above 90%, we think that's a positive thing. Again, that doesn't say that there isn't things that we shouldn't be doing to improve supports and continue to improve retention. But I also think that we should point out areas where we're doing well. And retention rates of our staff groups above 90%, from those metrics of an HR perspective, teaching perspective, those are things that we would say that we are above average in, and that we are doing well in. And so that's what we base those kind of those statements on.
Is the retention rate so high because there's just a lower amount of teachers of color compared to the white teachers? Like, is that perspective when we say that our retention rate is high?
You know, we'd really have to dig into that a little bit. I mean, I don't think it's any secret that obviously we have many more white teachers than we have teachers of color. But I think that goes to Rebecca's point about exit surveys and doing more exit surveys. And, you know, I think even as critical as exit surveys is more, if we call them stay surveys or some other type of employee feedback loop where we talk to employees while they're here, right? What makes you want to stay part of the organization? What makes you want to come to work? That's how we improve our retention practices, is trying to find out what are those things that really drive people to get up in the morning and want to be a part of an organization. And so I think that we need to do both of those, and that would help us get more at the question of what you're asking, instead of just, you know, comparing the numbers. The numbers can tell part of the story, but I think, as we all know, they don't tell the whole story.
And I think, to recognize what Chase is saying there about we still have identified needs for additional supports for our teachers of color and our administrators of color. And, we've taken a couple initial steps to do that, but we know that we have a long ways to go on that because we do know part of keeping them is, some things that they feel like they have a community they're connected to and that they can relate to. And, that's where we want them staying and we want that. And so we obviously don't want that to turn in the other direction either because of some of the conversations we're having around some of these other issues tonight. So appreciate that conversation around personnel definitely in some of our work we can look at there moving forward.
And just please, other ideas, send them our way. We don't have all the solutions. And so other thoughts that you have, other gaps or other things where you think we need to focus, let us know what they are. We want to try to incorporate those. If you were under the meeting, you heard my comments again about the teaching shortage and how we need to look at it differently. And so if you have suggestions, we would love to hear those and to incorporate those in the work that we're doing as we move forward.
Okay, just moving on to the last piece, which is community engagement under the DEI Action Plan 5A. So we proposed having listening sessions to increase some parents' participation and community engagement, which I know is difficult under normal circumstances and probably very tricky under the current circumstances. But the city's managed to do it. So I think it's an important thing that's more of an immediate action. Under the more long-term recommendation, we proposed having a process that was similar to the LGBTQ policy that was developed where a committee was formed with a diverse group of stakeholders and recommendations were made to draft that policy. Our equity program director, Andrea Jane, was a part of that process and she's here tonight. And so I asked her to sort of explain a little bit about how that process went. If you don't mind, Andrea, jumping in.
Oh, yeah. Hi. So I think I have met everyone, but I'll just really briefly introduce myself again in case I don't know any of you. I'm Andrea Jane. I am the equity program manager at the district for the equity and diversity department. And since Laura's not here, my role tonight, and correct me if I'm wrong, any of my bosses that are in here, is really just to provide some context since I've worked the longest on the LGBTQ initiative, so I can kind of explain the process of that and how that could be mirrored into a racial justice initiative. So I think what they were getting at in the action items of involving community engagement is for the LGBTQ initiative. It started out using a combination of our student climate survey, which we have a partnership. We had a partnership with the University of Iowa. We used the student climate survey data and then formed a task force that was made up of students, parents, community members, and staff to develop a roadmap is what they called it, which was a list of recommendations that had varying short and long-term goals. That was a holistic initiative that affected a lot of different things in the district. I know a lot of you are aware of this. One of the focal points was passing a very comprehensive LGBTQ support policy and administrative guideline. And then some of the other things are curriculum review or facilities for the bathrooms. You know, it really had a hand in lots of different things. So I think this was the idea of when we're doing restorative practices, since I think we all know there's not just a really simple fix for this, and there's not just one area that this affects. It touches every aspect of our district. So I think that the idea of getting a lot of diverse people involved in forming a task force, or maybe perhaps using some data to create some recommendations that are very broad, would be what was meant by the mirroring the LGBTQ policy, not necessarily like doing the exact same thing, just following what worked with that initiative. And I wanted to clarify that the LGBTQ initiative is by no means perfect, nor is it by any means done. So just using what worked and creating a structure and a process to mirror that, I think, and correct me, Jane, if I'm wrong, I think that's the idea of the action item. And I can clarify anything for that.
Thanks for that, Andrea. I think that part of what we've talked about too with Sarah Brooke is we've kind of transitioned some of that work internal as we've lost Sarah, and some of that partnership effort with the University of Iowa is how we do transition some of that work over, incorporate that kind of model that was taught to us into our processes. And so I think that's an important process for us to follow that created a couple positives for us here, most recently the LGBTQ initiative. And so we're still engaged in those conversations with Dr. Brooke, even though she's in Delaware right now. But as we transition some of that work inside, if this was a area we wanted to follow that, I do think it's yielded positive results for us before around bringing the survey forward, the LGBTQ component, as we've identified that work, and then to put a solid process around it has been especially positive.
All right, so since everybody's just got some stunned silence, one of the things I was wondering about, and this is more for the board and the admin team, but I think as we try and identify our next steps, one of the things we could do is even next weekend when we have our board retreat, right, we can look at one of our goals, either generically as a goal or more specifically in different pieces, work on how to update policies and practices to incorporate these recommendations, as well as what the IFR has given us, take that on as a specific goal. Is how do we then implement it into all of our stuff? But we can also we do have very specific equity goals in there too, so we could parse it out if we need to, or have it its own standalone thing. So I think that's a way to help at least the board side of things to keep moving those pieces forward. I think admin's working on their pieces now. They're not waiting on things that they can take action on. So I think they'll continue to do that. But I think that might be a way for us to start doing some stuff, even ahead of, any other board action type meetings, right? We can get them into our goals and then figure out how to take those action steps. I think some of the things that we have talked about in past meetings is things that do need to get put into policy to sort of add that layer of protection, more than just making a little statement or whatever. I think the SRO conversation came to mind from, I think the previous meeting, is like actually putting that sort of thing into policy that makes it that much harder to undo later. So that type of thing. So we'll have to figure out what needs to go into full board action. But I think a good starting point is goals at our retreat next weekend. I don't know if anybody has any takes on that.
I think goals, Sean, I like that. And the other thing I would just ask the board to think about is probably helping determine some priorities around those action steps. Because if we're being realistic and we're going to do a good job with some of those things, even though we've suggested all of those things in that as action steps, we can't do them all at once. And so I think we need to know what is the priority and where do we want to start. And I think we'd have some recommendations, obviously, on where we think some of those priorities are. You heard me talk about culture earlier tonight. And I think anything that, gets at the root of our culture is especially important for us to work on. We want to do all those things, and we think that a lot of those are critically important, but we also need to set some priorities around where we're going to start and how we're going to engage in that. So I would just ask you guys to continue to think about that one too, to give us some direction on that from your end.
And in terms of priorities, I think it's struck most of the people on the equity committee for a long time that the disciplinary disproportionality really stands out as a possible, if not probable, contributor to differences in academic proficiency in the district. And to me, that I guess I will talk with the board during a retreat about putting that up fairly high on our priorities in terms of reducing those disproportionalities in discipline. I'm not quite sure how it's going to work out this coming year. Or that it may not work out this coming year, because we may be a very different school system, probably for most of the next year. But after that, I think it's something that could be changed in the district. I think JP, you pointed out some time ago that the equity committee heard a presentation by an assistant superintendent from Cedar Rapids or Marion.
Assistant principal.
Assistant principal, right? Okay. Several months ago, who described a drastic change that he instituted in his school that resulted in almost abolishing disproportionality and at least in office referrals or in however they were measuring discipline.
Charlie, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that's where we need to have some of this conversation and also be, real and try to be open about it, that we can rewrite discipline protocols and procedures all we want, but if we don't change practice and we don't change culture, we're going to continue to discipline kids. And so they can say whatever we want in some regard, and we have improvements we need to make on that end. But like you said, I mean, that example there from what that building principal in Cedar Rapids was able to do was really how they handled things on the front end of conversations. And then, yes, I mean, they still handled some things also on the back end when maybe there was disagreements. But I think that's another critical part. I think it's easy to go to discipline protocols and procedures and point the finger there, but that's already after an event's happened. What we need to do is to have fewer events happening and have fewer of these things occurring in our school buildings, because kids feel safe, they feel supported, they feel like they have people they can talk to. That's the root of the issue, I believe, oftentimes. And so that's the real conversation we need to get to too, instead of just dealing with the end result after we've already had, problematic things potentially occur, where we get into situations where things are escalated instead of de-escalated. So I think that's a great example for us to talk about and think about how we want to approach our work together.
Okay,
And just for context, that was school-wide restorative practices. I mean, that's what he did up there.
Right, great.
Yeah, I like Sean's suggestion of having that deeper conversation at the board retreat, and especially Matt's suggestion of making sure as a board we set priorities to sort of guide the administration team, because there's only so many of them and they're still dealing with issues related to the pandemic. So I want to make sure that we set priorities on certain things that we know that they will be successful and be able to do well, instead of spreading our team really thin where they're tackling like everything and nothing really gets done well. Because I don't know about you all, but when I try and do everything on my to-do list at work, yeah, lucky if one of those things get checked off for the day, if I'm not like super focused on what the priority is of that day.
One other question I had for the board was how they have interpreted or responded to or been moved by the accounts Black at ICCSD and LGBT at ICCSD on Instagram. Because I know for me, I don't know if those have been seen by the board, but those brought up a question of how it's been communicated to students the way that they should expect staff to be held accountable for being inclusive in the classroom. So that was a question that seeing those really a lot of really sad accounts of discrimination in the classroom, that moved me to think about that, and I'm wondering what the board's response to that was.
Yeah, I definitely took a look at that. It tipped me over to get an Instagram account to read that. So, and I'll tell you, Paris, it was a lot like, and Paul, you'll probably remember this meeting, and it was a couple meetings where a lot of students came to the board meeting and read off very similar accounts. And I was there, and I tell you, it's that same kind of impact. It's kind of that, gut punch kind of wake up call to know. I think that anecdotal stuff is helpful. And then I think also it's important for us to look at our data, because we have, we can tell a fuller picture that in some ways is probably worse, when you kind of know the numbers, but I think it does help to put stories with it. And I think it just, for me, just heightens the urgency behind the work.
I have a question as well. So with all of these stories and bringing students on committees and having student voices heard and making sure that like students of color can like have a safe place to share their stories, what are we expecting to do with it? Because there have been a lot of times where there have been spaces where all of those things can happen, and then the administration does nothing with it or very little. So now that we have this resource, Black at ICCSD, LGBTQ at ICCSD, what are we going to do about it?
Well, Deja, the thing, I think you articulated the problem about why it's there. I think that, and I'm not saying it's a problem that it's there. I'm saying I think that people took to that space and that avenue because of what you said before, that there's been room for those conversations in the past, and that people didn't feel like they were heard and weren't responded to, and nothing changed, nothing felt different. In my conversations I've had over the last several weeks with teachers of color, that is, we've talked about, when we use that word accountability, and we probe into that, well, what does that mean? And, I remember Monique, I'm just going to mention you here. So I hope you're okay calling me out, but she goes, Matt, what I mean is that nothing feels different. When I go back to my workplace or when I go back to school, nothing feels different with the environment, and so just in a general sense, I think nothing, on some semblance or, students sharing these experiences, nothing has felt different for them. So even if they felt like they've been able to tell somebody, or even if they felt like there's been a space to have that conversation, our rate of change has not met their expectations in that regard. And so now they've taken to a space that is out in the open for other people to see and hear their stories, because on some level they weren't feeling like they were heard and valued before. So for us, I think what we have to go back to is trying to honor those stories, to try to create spaces where those conversations can be had, that we do respond, and that we do, try to validate that experience and do make those critical changes to that. I don't think, we can respond to every individual situation that's put on a social media platform. I think what we have to do is look about what that means about our system and why we've seen people go that route. And so I think it's a twofold issue. I think the other issue is if people have complaints about specific people that they are wanting to be addressed, then we need to make sure they know how to navigate that process and what the process inside the district is to do that. And so I think long-term, we have to get back to creating spaces and feeling like people are honored and valued, and that they can have a space where there might be change led. And then when it's gotten to the point where the damage is done and it's to the point where there may need to be complaints addressed or something more significant, that they also know how to navigate that process. And I think that goes back to our action step around the ombudsman position, about making sure people have some help in how they navigate those channels in a large structure and large organization, because kids and families don't know how to do that all the time. And then it's like it's never dealt with either. So that's a couple things I think about. I don't know if that's necessarily the answer you're looking for, but that's, as I've thought about it, or as we think about where that goes, I think that's the honest truth around it.
Okay. How about I put it this way? So you mentioned people go back to their workplace, go back to their school, and nothing feels different, right? I've been involved in this district and its equity work for 4 years now. And I can say with all honesty that very little feels different. But when we do work specifically at West, and I visit with a teacher who was involved in that work, they're like, oh, this feels like totally different. Like, I think changes are being made already, when as a student of color, I don't feel that change, which makes me believe that the admin and teachers are only making change for what they feel comfortable doing. And if they do that, then that's not solving the problem at all, nor is it making it a better space for students of color. Because if they're only in their comfort zone, when I, as a Black person, have to be uncomfortable every day and vulnerable every day, then nothing's going to get solved. So we have to push people, admin, staff, teachers, to a point where they are uncomfortable so that we can get to that point of change. Because like waiting for stuff to happen, waiting for them to come to this kumbaya moment and this aha, like racism exists, it's taking too long. And I'm leaving this district this year. And like we're having the same conversations and nothing feels different. Nothing feels different.
And I just want to add on to what Deja was saying, that the impetus for that critical eye towards the way we hold teachers accountable, or the way we hold this sort of thing accountable and push for change, shouldn't come from students voicing their experiences with abuse. And I hope that that's recognized by the board, that the fact that the fact that a safe space had to be independently created by a student and became sort of a just this with the hope that these things could be recognized and some change could be made, is it's kind of disappointing, and it's dismal to look at that.
And adding on, even further recognizing that a lot of these stories that have been shared are of students voicing, trauma they've had to admin and staff and counselors, and still nothing being done. And so them having to create this space independent of that, I think also just further emphasizes Paris and Deja's point. That like often when they are, doing the right thing and reporting it, still nothing gets done.
Like for me, I was lucky enough to be listened to. Like I didn't have a supportive administrator in junior high. And when I got to high school, I had a very supportive administrator who was willing to listen to me. There are so many students of color, Black students in particular, that just slip through the cracks and they're not listened to. So they go through this system that already doesn't work for them, and they end up on the other side worse than when they started. So what can we do? What can we do about that?
Looks like you're wanting an answer there. You're not asking a rhetorical question there, Deja. And, I certainly appreciate what you're saying. I think what we have to do is several of the components we talked about tonight, right? I mean, I don't think there's an easy answer to that. And I think it starts with how we handle interactions with kids every day in our building. And, I hear the frustration, and you guys are hitting on, I think, some of the same points I was trying to make. The rate of change hasn't improved, quick enough for people. They don't feel like they had the space, as Paris talked about. So you go create a space, and, that's sad to see, right? And that's dismal that that's where it has to happen. And so as we've talked about these different steps in here, I think that's why it's so complex, and why I think the problem has to be addressed on so many levels. The expectations have to be raised. You talked about people being willing to change within their comfort zone, but how do we move people and folks outside of their comfort zone? I think that's the work in front of us. I think that's what has to happen. And so those are the thoughts rolling around my head as you asked that question tonight, as far as how we handle that.
And I'm just going to chime in and say that, I had a child K through 12, and the stories that's being shared are some of the things that she's also, just now sharing with me, some of the things that she experienced. So I think for us that this board, and hopefully the next board that we have that get elected in 2021, the folks that we're working with right now, I do know that they're committed to making that change. And it has taken way too long and damaged so many of our students in the system. And I acknowledge that, and I don't think anybody on here won't acknowledge that. And we do want to see a change, and we have to sort of take that ownership that Matt was talking about earlier, and then redirect that in what concrete steps that we can put into action to make sure change happens, and it's just not pushed down the road for another year or another group of students or another social media platform where people are talking about their experience in ICCD. So I'm committed, as long as I'm on the board, to working with our administration, and I just know that folks on here, they're committed too. So that's, I mean, I can't lay out concrete steps tonight, but know that I'm committed to being held accountable and holding others accountable to make sure we take those concrete steps to make change happen.
Yeah, and I just kind of want to jump off that because Ruthina makes a really good point. One of the dysfunctions in our system, is the fact that previous to this, we often haven't had a board that functions very well. We've had boards that, we've had 4-3 majorities swing from one election to another. And I think when you have that sort of disarray, it's hard to get any kind of work done. It's certainly not this hard work that you're right, Deja, people need to be out of their comfort zone. But if you're going to push people out of their comfort zone, that takes a concerted effort over a long term. And I don't know that in the past, this is the first time we've had, I don't know if this board has had any 4-3 votes. I mean, we're unanimous on most things. And I think that sort of shared vision helps admin put the pedal to the metal and move forward full throttle. And so this is where I'm telling you, local elections matter. The people who are in these seats, it's often kind of a throwaway. Oh, it's the school board, but this is where the rubber meets the road. And we're going to have, well, at this point, probably a board majority up again in 2021. And so as you folks are leaving the school system and becoming, voting age, I'll say, this is where you can probably have a bigger impact. It probably matters more who's on your school board than who the president of the United States is. It just is going to have more of a direct impact on your life and for you guys, certainly the lives of the students coming up next. And so that's where I think it helps to have a board who's united. And then when the campaign comes up, that's when you can hold people accountable and you can say, here are the problems. What are you going to do about it? And then and stay on your elected officials that they follow through. And it really makes a big difference. And I've seen that with this board. We've been able to get a lot of work done, and just because we function as a unit pretty well.
I'll throw, Ruthina uses the word accountable. I think that's what this all boils down to, right? Is accountability and, what are actions that, will be taken if people aren't following through with all of these processes and policies that we put into place. As Matt said, we could write up whatever we want, but if we don't change the culture and that type of stuff, it doesn't matter. So I think as we look at priorities of all these different things, I'd say looking at, how do we put in the DEI competencies into evaluations of our teachers and administrators. I think that's a big thing, right? Because that's how you're going to hold them accountable for doing the right thing. And without accountability, it doesn't matter what our intentions are. So I think that's the big push as to how we are going to see change. How is it going to feel different for the next student that comes in, so it doesn't feel the same for every year that they're in school, right? So to me, it's all down to accountability, and I think that's where we have to build our work around, is how we are going to hold ourselves and others accountable to these changes.
And I agree with that very much. In reading those posts on Instagram, I kept thinking, why is this staff member allowed to say these things that this student heard? What is going, why don't we have an accountability, an effective accountability system that, so that staff members understand and that if they're going to stay in the district, there are things that they cannot say, there are attitudes that they cannot have. And I hope we can get to that point relatively soon here.
I have a question about how accountability is implemented in the district that I asked in our last equity committee meeting too. But am I correct in saying that the main way that staff and administrators are held accountable for whatever policy or whatever standards or whatever DEI is presented by the board is through yearly evaluations that involve an administrator being in the room of a classroom for one day? Like what is the extent of that?
Well, the evaluation process is one way of maintaining accountability. There's also a complaint process that that students and staff can participate in saying, you know, that this staff person said this or did this at this time, and that we're supposed to, as a district, we're supposed to act on that complaint. We're supposed to investigate it. We're supposed to establish, you know, what happened, and if it's warranted. And oftentimes, if you look at those posts on Instagrams, there are many instances where behavior that warrants disciplinary action is not, that action is not following that behavior. One of the disadvantages of a complaint process is that it's an individual driven process, but I think there are ways we can address that that weakness also.
I think we need to, you know, move forward with, you know, the work that, you know, admin and the association have been doing on, you know, looking at stuff that can go into evaluations to, you know, define those expectations. I think that, you know, we're, you know, as I mentioned earlier, we're not going to talk a whole lot about personnel and discipline in this regard, but there's a lot of work being done to, you know, add that core piece into the evaluation process. So I think that's a necessary first step. So I think there's good work being done there. I don't know how much more folks want to talk. I want to thank everybody for being here. I'd say it's late, but our students are probably used to this. It's way past my bedtime, but is there any other kind of clarifications that we need to make with any of these recommendations? I think that personally from this conversation and our previous conversation with IFR that there's a lot of alignment in a lot of the recommendations, and I think a lot of alignment with some of the work administration is doing. I think we just need to figure out how to go a little farther in a few places and you know, kind of realign there. And so I think I've got a pretty clear picture of some of the requests that are being made of us. So I'd kind of give a last minute shot to you know, either admin or board members or anybody from equity that needs more clarification on anything.
I just say thank you to the equity committee and to our students for coming and sharing that tonight. We know that's hard, and you know, Deja, I can hear your frustration and in the years you spent, the work you've tried to do, and the groups I've seen you a part of. And so, you know, I just connect back to Ruthina's comment that the people sitting in front of you are committed to this work, and we're not going to go away, and we're not going to shy away from it. It's the most critical work we have in front of us to do.
Thank you for having us tonight. We know you're working hard, and we appreciate it.
All right. If there's nothing else, I guess I'd entertain a motion to adjourn our work session.
So moved.
Moved. Second.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right, thanks everyone for joining us. This is a good conversation, and we'll look forward to doing some next steps at our board retreat next weekend. And stay tuned.